Lorenzo Morris, and this is my persuasive speech for public speaking. My topic for my persuasive speech will be upon how racism still exists within America today. Imagine being discriminated upon the way that you look. Imagine being persecuted and charged for a crime or even given a longer sentence just because of the way that you look. If you are picturing this, you are imagining what it feels like to be a minority within society today. In the United States, racism remains a big issue, and according to 64% of Americans in a recent SurveyMonkey poll, they agree that racism is a huge problem within our society. As a biracial woman, I have personally been a victim of racism, and I believe that racism is a big prominent issue within our society that we have not addressed yet. While political commentary claims that we have progressed into a post-racial society, racism continues to shape the institutional, economic, and social culture of our American society. We must face the concept that we are victims of our racist culture in order to move forward to be a better society. In discussing racism, we must discuss the origins of racism. I believe that racism first started within the age of exploration, and so does Fredrickson. In an article done by Fredrickson on the origins of racism, it was seen that Europeans distinguished and made judgments about Africans at the time as heathens because they weren't as adept to the modern technologies of the time that should be kept in bondage. As slave trade became more common within our exploration over to the New World, and tobacco became a main trading point, slaves were seen as more equipped to do the hard labor that Europeans just weren't adapted to and that indentured servants at the time couldn't handle. While these Africans were being brought over to the New World, no rights were ever established for them until 1705 with the Slave Code of Virginia. This was the first law that distinguished the difference between a slave and a regular citizen. There was no rights for the slaves at the time, but the only thing to distinguish them as slaves was the race of their father, depending on how dark their father was. As we continued on our plantation-based system, slaves began to search for more rights, and we began to see the horrors of slavery and tried to move forward to abolish them. The Civil War tried to attempt to resolve this issue of slavery and to stop the unspeakable horrors that were going on. As we did, and as slaves did gain their freedom with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, we saw a booming of African Americans searching for their rights within the Reconstruction era. As our white counterparts had anxieties about our African Americans gaining these rights within our society, we saw the implementation of the Jim Crow laws. In a brief history of Jim Crow, it explains the segregation of our society and lists out some of the basic laws that African Americans and whites both had to adhere to within the society. There was no such thing as interracial marriage at that time. Blacks were seen as separated from, in almost every aspect, from restaurants to schools to theaters to even so far as drinking fountains. For a while, minorities put up with these lack of rights and stripping down of our basic human rights until around the 1950s, 1960s, where we saw the civil rights movement happen, and eventually we gained our civil rights. We got the Civil Rights Act of 1968. In this act, we saw that there was no more Jim Crow laws and that we were all seen as equal within our society. Now, of course, I know what you're thinking. Jim Crow, the abolishment of Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Act was an attempt that we were supposed to abolish the idea of racism and separating each other from one another just based on our skin tone. But that's not exactly the case. It's not even close to what happened. According to Britannia.org, we still see this racial profiling that goes on, and racism is still a very current issue within our society. According to Britannia.org, black drivers are 2 times more likely to be arrested within a traffic stop. I also discovered on this online journal article that whites were often given a warning rather than blacks were. Blacks were usually seen to give a ticket, which I found interesting. In our society now, we also see a lot of police brutality that goes on. Many of these cases occur against unarmed minorities, such as the tragic case of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. With these cases, we saw that these victims were not only just profiled, but discriminated against and often killed, deemed by the necessary use of force. These aren't the only horrendous errors we see within our justice system. We also see these cases of incarceration in which are unfairly done against. For example, on the case of rape with Brock Turner was only given months of probation, whereas Bill Cosby was given a longer sentence within jail. I can't help but believe that it's because he's African American. We see this common trend where minorities often get longer sentencing. But that's just not the only influence that we see of racism today. There's also economic disadvantages that we see. More minorities are expected to be on some form of social welfare, and we're also seeing as some stagnation within our community where we just can't move forward. There's not that many economic opportunities within our minority communities. Also, we see a consequence within our education system because of the racism that we encounter. According to an article by Bryce on the effects of racism within our educational system, there are many consequences to the racism that we experience today. Students have a harder time adjusting to school, not only adjusting, but just liking school in general. And parents lose their confidence within the educational systems. There's lower test scores. Schools with higher minority rates are less likely to succeed than schools with normal rates of students. This isn't the only play that we see within our society. I also feel as though our politics has a big influence upon racism today. Politics today likes to paint the picture that racism is no longer a factor, but we can see that racism and discrimination still exist from our recent election in 2016. From our president now and our presidential candidate Donald Trump, pictures of minorities were painted as killers, rapists, and murderers that should be separated by a wall. I can't help but think, has America just become colorblind to all this racism that's occurring? Or is it just becoming more predominant? Are we growing back to our racist past? Or is this class division just more or less apparent? More apparent than it was before? According to Malik Mukaya, the attitude of white supremacy has been embedded within our society, and we can't hide it, and we have to accept it in order to move forward. So I know the question that you're asking is probably, how can we fight back from all this racism that I just told you about in our society? We must stop all these racist movements that are going on, such as these white nationalists and the Ku Klux Klan that are coming back within our society, that are coming back to be a major topic. We must address our past in order to move forward. Without addressing our past and accepting that we were a racist society, there's no way that we would be able to move forward from it. I mean, just look at Germany, for example. Germany accepted that the Holocaust was an ugly, horrible thing that they had done to the Jews, and they accepted their racism, and now they're able to move forward from it. Now that we understand our racist past, the educational setbacks of racism, how politics have played into racism, and how it's had an effect on almost every aspect of our society, we have to think of what we can do to move forward from this. Think about that rate that I spoke about in the beginning. 64% of Americans believe that racism is still an issue within today's society. Where is that other 36% of Americans? We need to come together as a whole in order to fix this problem that we have. Once we are able to address our racist culture, we will be able to move forward. Thank you to all of my sources. I greatly appreciate you letting me use them, and I hope everybody enjoyed my speech. If there are any questions, feel free to comment underneath in the discussion post. Y'all have a good night.